Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode ever of Novel Ideas. I am Louis, and I haven't always been a reader. I've always liked reading, but it wasn't until my daughter was born and our television shared a wall with her crib that I stopped watching stuff and started reading stuff. And then I pretty much didn't look back. And the reason I wanted to start this podcast is that I would often get excited about what I was reading and needed to chat about it with other people. But it turns out that it's kind of hard to talk about novels in regular conversation. My wife, Claire, described me talking about the books I was reading as telling her about my dreams. So I went out and found people who also wanted to talk about novels, and thus this podcast, Novel Ideas. The first few episodes are all with the same interlocutors. My very good friend Tom Mitchell, in academic circles known widely as W.J.T. Mitchell, or Professor W.J.T. Mitchell, a retired professor of art and history at the University of Chicago, who I first started talking to about books when he asked me to introduce him to Anthony Trollope. And of course, he's retired and has plenty of time to read and has now completely dwarfed my Trollope knowledge. And my longtime friend Shlomo Sher, professor of philosophy at Cal State Fullerton and other outlets. I was actually freshman and sophomore roommates with Shlomo back in the early 90s, and he, of course, smoked me out for the first time. But later in life, I introduced Shlomo to his now spouse, Carmen Mitchell, who you'll hear briefly referred to in this podcast, who is the daughter of the aforementioned Tom Mitchell. So I kind of connected Tom and Shlomo. Now, though they are both PhDs, and incidentally, so is my aforementioned wife, I am not. So I am hoping that this podcast expands my knowledge in lieu of an advanced degree. And as this podcast goes on, you will learn more about them, along with all the other people I hope to bring on to do what is apparently what I like doing best, talking novels. The book we are discussing in this episode is Kazuo Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun, his 8th and most recent novel. Now, one important note, this is meant to be a deep dive into the book, so there will be spoilers. If you haven't read Klara and the Sun, you've been duly warned, though I have often found that I enjoy books sometimes even better if I know what's going to happen, which allows me to just let the language take me away. So maybe it's okay for you to listen to this even if you haven't read the book. Okay, here we go on our maiden voyage. Because we're recording natively on your machines, any audio glitches that happen because of this cloud interface, I will also get from your machine. So
is the cloud getting in the way of the sun? So we're losing energy?
Yes, exactly. The cloud is shining, blocking brightly. The sun.
Here in Chicago, everything is bright and sunny.
And it is bright outside. He has given me his strength and nourishment. Let's dive in. Let's just start talking about the book. I've read Remains of the Day and I read Never Let Me Go. How many Ishiguro books?
I've read both of those. I read Never Let Me Go, but remind me about Remains of the Day. I may have read it, I may have forgotten.
It was made into a movie in the mid-90s with Anthony Hopkins, but it was about a butler at a manor house in England from the 1930s and in the 1940s. And what you're experiencing it is that he's sort of watching from the outside and with very little understanding of what's happening, the eventual irrelevance of noble families being involved in politics, right? So here is a noble family who is talking to German noble families, and they're all going, we're going to solve all of these global crises, where you realize as a reader that they are irrelevant and that the real diplomacy is happening at the elected official level as opposed to the appointed official level.
Yeah, it's coming back to now.
And I feel like that is a theme that runs through Ishiguro books a lot. The protagonist or the point of view of the story is from a narrator who doesn't understand entirely what's happening, but you as a reader have more knowledge than they do, right? And it happens and again, I've only read 3, but it happens in Remains of the Day. He's a butler. He doesn't understand diplomacy. Never Let Me Go. The main character is being raised for organ farming. And we know that. And she even knows that, but she doesn't understand the greater implications of that. And we do. And then, of course, Klara, poor Klara.
Poor Josie, who's also being modified. that word lifted,
Yes.
for Josie, it's never explained, as far as I can tell, exactly what is done, but it didn't work. It damaged her somehow. They were manipulating her and trying to improve her performance.
And you don't necessarily get the idea from the book that lifted is something that's better. You know they're lifted, and you know that
Costs a lot of money. You have to be with a better class to get it.
Even though we keep on hearing this word lifted, and I'm glad we're kind of talking about the word itself, it assumes a different rank, like a caste system, right?
Yeah.
Yet he is the only character in the book who demonstrates an actual genius. No one else does.
Yeah.
No one else represents genius except for him, and yet he's the one that is looked at as lower.
But it's clear that from the opening that Klara is unusual. And the unusualness is her, what in AI terms they call the general intelligence. That is, she is learning on the job constantly. She's curious. She wants to know what's behind something, what's around the corner, and she's empathetic. She's been trained not to be too empathetic. When they look at you, don't necessarily make eye contact right away. But she can't resist. As soon as somebody addresses her, she's there.
She does learn to kind of be empathetic, but it's interesting that what that ultimately results in is a kind of blind faith, not necessarily like a scientific reasoning of what's happening, but she actually develops a blind faith for what, for lack of a better term, a deity.
Yeah, the sun is her god. I mean, makes perfect sense at an earlier stage in human development. We thought that, we worship the moon, the sun, the stars. She's like at an earlier cognitive stage of human development, but she's, as far as I can tell, she is almost perfectly human in many respects, even though she knows I'm different, I'm something else. But boy, that's what I think the magic of the novel is. How close can you come without crossing the threshold to being a human being?
Does she demonstrate human traits beyond any of the other characters? And
anxiety. She's filled with anxiety. Am I not doing a good job? She's constantly worrying. Am I making a mistake here? Should I hold back? Am I being too expressive? Those are the things that that humanize her. And then you're reminded constantly, oh, wait, no, she's not a human. She is this animated doll, but a very complicated animated doll.
And she's a friend. And this is one of the things that really, this idea of she's an artificial friend, but she's not exactly a friend, but she's sort of a friend, because it's hard to exactly be a friend when you're literally being programmed to do this job. You're not exactly choosing, who you're going to be interacting with or caring for. Tom, the part that makes her possibly not human, this fading away that she has, I was thinking about this as a kind of bigger theme related to what we talked about with the next model and being replaced. But, she has a limited life objective, that is her main life objective, and she seems completely content not doing anything but her main life objective, and she doesn't have the ability to overcome that life objective. And when that life objective is done, she is happy to just fade away.
Yeah, and the way she fades away, though, is that she ends up in this junkyard, basically. Like, it isn't even like she's completely spent. And that's what I thought was interesting, that her idea of life objective is an illusion, right? She thinks it, but then, like, when she's sitting in that junkyard at the end, to me, she's still very much alive and useful and not degraded in any way. She's just thrown away.
Yes, she's like, all of the stories of the discarded doll. What this story does is to make that discarded doll come alive, and you imagine the doll sitting there capable of waiting endlessly and patiently. And only a machine could wait that long without sadness, without feeling like, oh my God, I'm a complete failure. No, she was a friend. She did her job. And in a sense, that job is over now. And so what else is there for her? Be patient.
from that perspective, maybe she lived a life well lived. It's goals have been accomplished, right? I mean, she did it.
Being a doll is very temporary. She's what Freud called a transitional object.
Right.
The security blanket, the teddy bear, and then the doll is the best friend. And talk to our spouses about their relationship to dolls.
And looking at my daughter, she came on the plane and the most precious thing for her to have on the plate are these 5 stuffed animals that we literally 5, and we literally stuffed them into her backpack. The only thing in her backpack were these 5 dolls. But I wanted to mention something else, talking about her humanity, right? The other thing that really struck me is that every other character, even though they have love and connection to some of the other characters in the story, are really acting in very selfish ways. The mother wanting now to just replace her daughter because she's looking into the future and she's more concerned about how she's going to feel than anybody else. The father who has this connection to a political reality that he thinks everybody should just adopt. Rick, who definitely loves her and loves his mother, but is also very much thinking about his future and what he's doing. Rick's mother, who wants the best for her child and will basically be a little, not duplicitous, she'll suck up to this powerful man to get what she wants.
Right.
Everybody is acting and compromising themselves in certain ways, and yet Klara is not. She is selfless, and she is true to herself and the people in her life in a way that is like all the admirable qualities that we attribute to saints are kind of embodied within her.
Self-sacrifice being, the chief one for the saint.
But I mean, is it self-sacrifice if your entire life goal, is exactly to do this? I mean, and this is the huge difference. I was thinking about when we first talked about this idea of the next model, and I thought that this is what the story was going to be about.
Right.
Like all technology, the next model comes out and we're dealing with the existential crisis or whatever of a being that is being replaced in that way. And it didn't turn out to be that way. The next model seemed to be not even as good, according to the store manager, right? So somehow she struck the balance. But, the big difference between Klara and the celebrity who has the 15 minutes of fame and then, is replaced is all these people have other things to do, right? If you're a model, that's a part of your life. If you are the model that Klara is, being this model is your life. You have a purpose. I was thinking of Sartre talk about how existence precedes essence for people, right? This idea that, we don't have a purpose. This to me is the big difference, right? If Klara is replaced, there is nothing else, right? If she's done with this part of her life, there is nothing else. And this is, to me, a really big difference between kind of the humanity of the situation or what it means to be a human, to not have this kind of fixed purpose or to have multiple purposes where she could spend months or years doing nothing.
I wonder if it's quite that closed at the end. Of course, she's in the junkyard. She's been, abandoned. I feel like the end of the novel leaves that open, just like the model who has been replaced, lost her looks, no longer there. There's always contingency. So as I ended the story, I didn't feel like it was a sad ending. What if somebody walks into the junkyard and said, hey, look at that? That's what a junkyard is for. You go there and you find something been abandoned. Maybe you reclaim it.
I like the idea of retro as a concept. I got this feeling that the opening was a very 1950s conception of shop. There was a manager, there were mannequins. It was very 1950s, right?
Show window.
Yes, show window.
What I like about science fiction that Ishiguro writes is that it doesn't have to be a direct conversation with our own timeline.
No.
That he is painting a picture of a society that could happen if things may have went differently, but it's not necessarily overtly alternative reality like Man of the High Castle is alternative reality, right?
Right.
It's more of he's painting his own world. And in the same way, even the way that individuals kind of live these emotionally repressed lives reminded me of the 1950s. And so when I looked at the junkyard, we don't know how many years have passed. We know the manager has long since retired, so it could be decades, right? Just like 50s has a retro charm, 80s has a retro charm now. Is there a retro charm to reclamating some of these dolls from this like second level release, that I thought was really cool?
To me, that seems like a different story in the sense of, if I was going to continue her story, this would be it, but now would be a kind of, a next novel, a different story altogether. I totally thought that the idea was that she was giving a limited lifespan, a little bit like the replicant in Blade Runner, with some more flexibility. And the whole idea is that when the mission is done, you are no longer needed and you are junk. And I like this idea of being able to be reclaimed in some way.
But I think there's something that Ishiguro is really trying to say, though, with the fact that, a limited lifespan, she's put in the junkyard, but she doesn't go away. She's not a replicant for Blade Runner that shuts down. She keeps going. There's a very strong idea of the old and new, as in the old gets discarded and the new doesn't. And that, to me, was very much it's what consumer culture in America is all about. But I feel like the 1950s really brought that. I feel like the 1940s, 30s, 40s was about doing more with less. It was the war effort, that kind of stuff. And then the 50s comes by and it's like, no, we always need the new model. Right. And I'm wondering if that 50s sensibility, if he was consciously writing that into it, or is it something I was just laying on top of it because of my own biases?
Makes sense to me. I see what you're saying. Yeah, it didn't occur to me to call it the 50s exactly, but the idea is you've got to have the newest model. But there's something else about the time frame of the novel. It feels like it's not in the present so much. I like the idea of the 50s as the kind of mood of the time.
I want to pull on that thread a little bit. Why does it not feel in the present?
Mannequins. I mean, number one, like going shopping at a store, a store window where passerbyers will be looking at you. I mean, that just doesn't seem at all present day, and I think the show window is really, that just seems such an outdated idea.
Either that or it's so futuristic that everything is taken for granted. The idea of mannequins in a show window, that what you're shopping is not for the clothes on the mannequin, but the mannequin itself, which can talk and walk, is so bizarre. But it's made so matter of fact, as if, of course, you're getting out of the taxi. Do you feel the novel is set in New York City?
I mean, yeah, I think so.
But they live out in the country.
Yeah.
Right. I assumed London.
Maybe London, yeah. Because, London did have a cosmopolitan 50s as well. And yeah, it's very much, even to this day, right outside of London, you can still get to the country pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And what about the other locations? Let's talk for a minute about the spaces of the novel, where things happen. There's the sort of the doctor's office, which is an incredibly sinister place with all of these secret rooms where stuff is going on you don't know about. I felt that this is where it's getting creepy and like verging on horror. And this doctor is so confident that he's got the cure for everything. Don't worry, well, I'll fix it.
Now that you say it, I definitely am responding to it, but that was actually a location that didn't actually impact me until now. I might want to go back and read it just so I can really examine that. And we're talking about the doctors. We're also talking about the photo studio, right? Where
that's what I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the photo studio with this, you can write a book that's straightforwardly about the horror of machines replacing humans. Right? This here, it's almost like it's a side story, a possibility. Now, what it's done, it's a little bit illegal, or maybe a lot illegal. It's definitely questionable, and they don't end up going there. Yeah, I'm curious if you guys thought that at the end of the day, it would have been interesting to have Josie die and to have Klara become Josie, if that would have been a more interesting ending.
One of the other questions I've set up for this call here actually is the story we thought was going to happen never happens. And let me give you a few examples. The relationship with Josie doesn't develop. We think that's going to develop over time and it doesn't develop. the tutoring of Rick that the mother asked for, we're like, oh, good, he's going to be able to be tutored by this like intelligent force, and but that never happens. The revolution that the father wanted doesn't really happen. Like when we hear the father as part of this community, and is there going to be some sort of conflict between what the father's community is all about in this consumerist culture that he's fighting against? Because remember, he's been made irrelevant, right? The idea is that more and more and more and more jobs are being made irrelevant because of robots and technology, and he is an engineer who's been made irrelevant, so is part of this community, and that he's trying to justify as a better way of living. But that never turns into anything. Josie is never replaced by this AF that this guy is building, that the mother wants to happen. We were talking about the limited lifespan where she just shuts down over time. That never happened. She ends up in a junkyard. And also all that talk about how the AFs fear walking by the window at the beginning, of the tension between AFs that have yet to be purchased and the AFs that have already been purchased, that Josie seeds at the beginning, also never turns into anything. So Shlomo, I guess what I'm saying is, I want to answer your question, but I'd like to put it into the context of all of these other endings or directions a novel could have gone that never happened.
It's world building, isn't it? I mean, these are all aspects of a world. And I was originally going to say that with all three of those books, all three of them are servants of some kind. Klara is clearly a servant. The butler is a servant. And the kids in Never Let Me Go are also servants of society because they're, mandatory organ donors who are there. And all of it kind of put you in the world, and where you're seeing the world from the perspective of not just a servant, but a being that is destined to be a servant. I mean, even with the butler, the butler's dad, was a butler, right? And so he's kind of born into it. And in every one of those, it seems to me that the main attraction really is not the protagonist, but the world that they're kind of taking you into.
Yeah, you're right. In all of these, it isn't really about the fate of the servant. It's about a fate of the world. And all the questions we're asking ourselves is kind of about the world. We actually haven't really talked about Klara as her own arc in a way. We're looking at kind of the arc of the perspective she gives us through the course of the story, and that would be similar to the arc of the perspective that the butler gives in Remains of the Day and that the protagonist gives in Never Let Me Go. They themselves are almost unchanging in a way.
But here's a question. Do we identify and sympathize with Klara, even though she's locked into her role and is not going to escape it? Isn't part of the effect of the novel our identification with this character who could be different, could be more, something else could happen but doesn't? I feel like there's a certain sadness to the identification.
Yeah.
Because you can see for yourself, there's an identification and distance at the same time. Klara's different from me, and why am I identifying, and what does that do? That paradox of disidentification and seeing everything from her point of view and hoping things from her point of view, and then realizing those hopes ain't gonna be fulfilled. It's a very unusual thing, I think, in fiction to be able to do that. I'm trying to think of other novels that, sometimes human characters you can identify. You are in their point of view or proximate to it.
Responding to that, I'd like to bring it back to this idea of all the storylines that don't happen in this story. That you're right. I feel like as I was reading, I almost wanted Josie to be put in the role of the hero, and that there was going to be a justification for her position and an impact she has on society, whether that be tragic or that of a hero that overcomes adversity. Yeah. But Ishiguro never lets that happen. He always keeps her kind of moving. She grows.
And she gets better, right?
She gets better, yeah.
Why does she get better? Do you have any account of that? Why does she suddenly
clearly the sun treatment did it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, this to me was the weakest part of the story that I didn't understand why she got better, or that it was meant to be that the sun treatment really did it. If I remember correctly.
What I like about where it goes and what I like about the fact that she develops a blind faith is that at some point, blind faith is the only thing people have. The thing about this illness that Josie has is it can't be, no one knows how to cure it, right? Some kids get over it and some kids don't. She suddenly does something that we know is not going to work. And in my opinion, Josie just gets better. This is a crisis point for these people in this family, but it doesn't define everything about this family because as we see at the end, Rick goes on to college and Josie goes on to college and the mother, they keep on going in their lives.
That's because she lives, right? I mean, that's the key thing, right? If she died, everything is hinging on her living. If she dies, everything is going to change.
I feel like maybe even the scope of her illness was also probably exaggerated by the mother, right? The mother being freaked out about this. Maybe if we were to see this story from a different perspective, we see that Josie wasn't actually that sick. We don't know what the stakes of the human story are. We only get her understanding of it. Whether Josie lives or dies, I feel like is not really part of the story that we're following. Yes, you're right. It would have changed if Josie died anyway, but I feel like then it would have been a different story for Klara, meaning that there was a chance that her faith was destroyed. And so whether it was fate that kept Josie alive and made Klara continue her faith, I guess I'm less interested in that as I don't think it's the weak part of the story. I think it's a strength of the story that Ishiguro is constantly avoiding having to gratify any of our expectations.
There's a kind of alternative story, which is typified by the film Her, in which the AI moves on because the AI has become fully conscious and has achieved general intelligence, which is full of surprise, creativity, and so forth. So instead of being a transitional object, the Scarlett Johansson bot is going on to 700 more lovers. It's like the same story. She actually expresses love, but she's capable of boundless love with numerous lovers. And that leads me to the question, is Klara sad at how her life turned out? Is she disappointed? Did she expect something different, that she would be friends forever, that she would live as long and would live close to Josie? That's another story that could have been told in which Josie says, okay, you're not my only friend anymore, but I want you with me always.
Louis, you mentioned the 1950s. There is something very anachronistic about this book. To me, the expectation today of a story like this would be that the AI finds agency and rewrites her story. And we're kind of expecting that now. I don't think Klara does this at all. I really think she's, at the end of the day, fairly satisfied as far as that can go, doesn't really desire anything anymore. You know, her job, her whole being was very, very limited, and she served her purpose, and job well done, and it's over. Where that is something you could have written in the 80s or something and have it really worked out with audience expectations a lot more than today. Today, we're expecting the dystopian novel where this is going to be turned into a series that's going to show how she's going to liberate all the AI and blah, something like that, right? And I like the anachronistic element of it.
Klara does win in the end. She does the hero's journey. She starts with a crisis. She deals with a crisis by appealing to the god, and Josie gets better. So in her mind, she wins. So Shlomo, to your previous statement about is she satisfied with her life, I feel like she is, right? Ishiguro was really good at subverting our expectations, but not in a way that seems counter to our expectations. That we're letting all these possible things happen, and he navigates them very dexterously without ever shocking you, giving you the, oh my God, I never saw that coming. And that's what I love about Ishiguro. That's what I love about reading him. There's this very meditative quality about getting to the end of this journey and not feeling like you knew where you were going or that you had to get somewhere.
In narrative theory, there's a name for this. Critical Inquiry just published an article on situation in fiction. I would say this is a novel of situation, much more than plot. The plot is extremely simple, but situations can be really complex without having a complicated plot full of surprises, unexpected turns, and so forth. And I feel like that's one thing that's in common with Ishiguro's novels. You postulate a situation and you just explore it in the most deft, subtle way that you can and treat it, as you said, Shlomo, as a world where, shit happens or doesn't happen. But the plot and the big surprise, that's not the point.
And it is refreshing because I feel like our present moment is so plot heavy, and we have been for decades plot heavy, that there has to be a very specific gratification of a premise that's been established. I think it's resonates more with us as humans because oftentimes, though we want to place ourselves in the hero of our own story, we're not. We're living day to day. And we're dealing with the situation of our lives. And that's actually more like humanity than there's some of us who have an amazing plot-filled story to tell. And we like to hear those stories from people. We go, oh my God, that's amazing that you escaped this coup in this African country and you made it to America. And we savor those plot points. Yeah. But most people, even though they have very interesting lives, don't have the kinds of lives that are sort of knocked about by plot. And I think that is very interesting about Ishiguro and all his novels, is that it makes that situation, as you say, just so engaging. And it's a magic he has, because I guess in all the books I've read by Ishiguro, they are deceptively simple. You're reading them and you're like, oh, this seems very straightforward to me. But as Shlomo, to your point, as the world builds, that's where the complexity comes in. It's very much like how video games are interesting. Some of the more interesting video games is that if you could just spend time in the world, you could take the missions and you could advance the plot. But that's something that's almost a matter of course. It's really people want to live in these worlds that they can explore and look, and the world is authored for them. It's the same interest I have in immersive theater and video. I'm much more interested about authoring the world as opposed to authoring the plot.
One difference between this and The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go is that in those books, the world is pretty self-contained. Like, you really understand what the world is. It doesn't. Here, this whole idea of lifting, like, that's just barely mentioned. It's almost never explored, right? There's so many tangents that we could have gone on in this world. And that's really different, I think, than at least the other books of his that we're talking about.
I feel that Never Let Me Go, though, you still don't know a lot. Like, we never meet anybody who's had an organ transplant that's from one of these people. We never see the politics of how this is played out. We never see any of that stuff. So in a way, we are kind of a little blind. But to your point, though, actually, that's a really good point. I would say Remains of the Day, because it takes place in a world we already know, we could fill in a lot of the gaps. With Never Let Me Go, I think he's purposely keeping us in the dark. With this, he's revealing so much, but as much as he reveals, there's so many more questions.
Right. And again, it's not about a plot that what he wants to tell. How did this situation come to be? That's not the question. The situation, this is the way things are. And we're not really even going to question it. We're not going to reflect on it very much. We're going to slowly discover what lifting, what the results of that are. We're sort of seeing them in everyday life, but there's no story about, how did they get started on trying to genetically alter children to make them smarter? Or in Never Let Me Go, what revolution occurred in the law that allowed people to clone themselves so they would have a twin to grow up alongside them and serve as organ donors? And Ishiguro says, that's not the point. Let's look at the situation as given.
Yeah, I would love to talk to somebody who teaches science fiction and ask them where Ishiguro fits. Because I think that's very interesting, that it's a different kind of science fiction. And that's why I'm so drawn to it, because I am a science fiction writer. I do read a bunch of science fiction.
You're a science fiction writer, too. I didn't know.
Oh, reader. Sorry, reader.
Look
I
at
don't
the
know.
time.
I mean, your plays
I
on genetic
am.
engineering was
Yeah,
a
yeah. I mean, I
science
guess,
fiction writing.
yeah, and I've read a science
So you
fiction
have
play
done that.
about a genetically created companion. It was just a baby instead of a fully grown adult, AF. But and again, I'm looking at my own play, and my own play, the whole point of it is that this baby only lives for 3 weeks. And at the point the person falls in love with it, he actively tries to keep that baby alive. And then, of course, with disastrous consequences, right? I almost fall into the same trap, right? As other science fiction writers, I want to tell you the the plot of this amazing thing that happens. And so, again, that's why reading Ishiguro is so powerful to me from a science fiction perspective. Like, I'm reading Gene Wolfe right now. And Gene Wolfe, in a way, is very much like Ishiguro in that Gene Wolfe is creating these massive worlds. But where Ishiguro writes a 200-page novel that gives you a glimpse of this massive world, Gene Wolfe writes thousands of pages over many books that sort of like pulls you into this world in a dynamic way. But let me bring it back to the sinisterness that you mentioned, Tom, about the doctor's office. We talked a little about the photo studio also have a sinister quality. Oh, another sinister element is the pollution machine.
I didn't read any of these as sinister. I read them all as tragic.
I'm old school on tragedy. It's got to be a figure of heroism and nobility who falls from a great height due to a flaw in their character or some kind of nemesis that is a threat to us all.
Really, you could only really have tragedy if what you've done is you've built up this hero and then seen the hero fall.
A servant can never be tragic. Their life can only be ironic, which is, I think, the butler, the clone, and the artificial friend. They cannot be tragic. What they can do is expose a world and suffuse it with irony because they see from the point of view that we understand the world now from a different angle. That's what irony does.
Can the world itself be tragic? Because it's not just the world. It's, we're comparing that world to our own. We're seeing a fall in that world. So if we go to Never Let Me Go, right, society has fallen into, accepting the enslavement of clones. A world that somehow allowed its children to be subjected to this and has allowed conscious beings to have these sorts of lives with debates that don't seem to be happening about it, that are barely even mentioned. Maybe that's a fall.
Does this mean that the concept of hero and tragedy doesn't apply to this? Or does it mean that the concept of hero and tragedy has changed in our society for people who are writing in a contemporary setting? I don't mind if the answer is, well, yeah, in a modern context, it's almost archaic to write about hero and tragedy.
Yeah, it is. That's why, a lot of writers have claimed, modern tragedy, with the fall of great ones, of great power, great character, and so forth, that has not been open to us for some time. So we don't live in a tragic age. We live in an age of irony, which satire, a lot of science fiction is basically satire. The only thing that's, I think, capable of tragedy now may be the fate of the species itself, the self-destructive character of the species. This is why I plowed through all 3 volumes of the 3-body problem, because I think it is the epic. And epic and tragedy are very closely associated. Achilles, Agamemnon, you have to have heroes. And the heroes of the 3-body problem, they are significant characters. The astrophysicist becomes the figure of the greatest imagination, understanding not just what's happening in front of them, but the universe, and having a span of 400 years for a novel. Nobody has tried that.
What you do as a hero, though, you are single-handedly or with a group facing a very large adversity, and you either triumph or you fail, and the failure is what's called the tragedy. Even in the 3-body problem, our heroes, again, are more a consequence of the situation, a lot like Ishiguro, which again is feeding into your idea that a modern way of writing doesn't necessarily celebrate heroes in the same way.
It's interesting because, the title is Klara and the Sun, right? Rather than Klara and Josie or anything else. And I think we got to talk about that relationship.
The role of the sun in this book as a character, but also the role of the sun as an image. And Tom, just based on your now decades-long pursuit of the image and what the language of that image is. I mean, what was your initial response to the sun as an image in this book?
On the one hand, it was quite literal. She's a battery-powered robot that needs to be recharged, and she's got an internal monitoring system that tells her when she's in danger of running out of juice. So as long as she's got access to the sun, that makes her functional, conscious, and so forth. She feels good. But then there's the second level to it. What's the sun, a metaphor for or a symbol? And for Klara, the sun is personified. The sun is God in her one robot religion. The question of where he goes becomes, she's constructing her own inner narratives about that. So it's a kind of proto-religion, and showing how in an intelligent being, religion could arise out of fundamental needs. The need for life, nourishment, and so forth could be something that you pray to, you wish for, you invoke it.
She's developing it herself. It's a religion of one. She's not proselytizing.
No.
She's not getting the details of this religion from other people. She completely forms it herself, and it stays within her the entire book.
Yeah. Because you guys are assuming that she came up with these ideas about sun herself, and that makes complete sense. But I actually read it originally as these ideas about the sun were generally shared by the AFs, that the AFs had this kind of regard for the sun as this something special, and that maybe it was installed by the actual creators. This was in the very beginning, and I forgot the very, very beginning, right? They could have a reason to really do that. And it's interesting to me what that reason might be. It could be, again, just like Tom said, she's battery powered. But, they put them at the back of the store, but you're going to die, run out of power if you're not in front and getting enough sun. So is this kind of a, like the Homo religios, we're supposed to have like religion kind of built into us. Maybe they decided that building in some sort of religious object into these AFs would, make good practical sense in order to keep them surviving.
Well, let me put it this way then, because I agree with you. I think the idea that as an evolutionary tool, it would make sense to build into these robots the necessity to crave the sun and to be aware of the relationship with the sun, because that's how they survive. But we're speculating on this because it's not in the book. We're speculating on this because it's an interesting question. But if you look at the text itself, there's no discussion of the sun with other AFs.
Yes, there is.
Oh,
in the beginning, isn't there?
With Rosie?
This is the thing I think we're forgetting. I just reread the opening. She has dialogues with Rosa.
Oh,
about,
I got to go back.
And there are problems with malabsorption of the sun's rays. And Rosa, at one point, there is a patch of sun on the floor. And Klara reaches out and puts her hands down on the patch of sun, and it disappears. And Rosa accuses her of sucking up the sun's rays, of being selfish. So if you just read the opening pages, Ishiguro sets the whole thing up with this strange mystique of the sun, which is shared. Of course, they all have a relationship to it. But the store manager tells Klara, you're special, you're different. Apparently, there's something in the engineering of these things that makes them not homogeneous. Each one has its own personality. And Clara's is one, she doesn't just want to be in the sun, she wants to see what's outside. Whereas Rosa is totally incurious about that.
And again, I mean, the manager does notice that as something very special about Clara's, just this curiosity. And she even stresses it when Josie's mother comes in. Like, all iPhones do the exact same thing.
Right.
And yeah, some of them might have flaws in them, but all of them do the exact same thing. What I love about what Ishiguro has painted here is that not all AFs are created alike. There's something in the engineering that really encourages a different kind of development.
I think that, human beings have a spiritual longing. And when it comes to human beings, this spiritual longing is just built in. And this idea of AI religion and AI spiritual feelings, and I just find the whole idea really interesting. We don't get deep insight into this here, but we do get a rare perspective of a really simple kind of religious transaction. I mean, this is transactional in some sense, right? I mean, she'll give the son this, this will be the sacrifice that will get her the God's attention. So it really does seem like a kind of religious act. How does a being get there, and how likely are AIs to develop, these kinds of religious ideas that are more than just mistaken scientific ideas? And here, maybe it is just a mistaken scientific idea that the sun is personified.
Yeah, I wanted to jump on that whole transactional element of religion. I love that idea, and it's almost simplistically transactional, right? Yeah, the sun is going to allow me to live, and I am going to do something for the sun as a result of that. But it's not diametrically transactional, meaning the sun is always
Sure.
giving her life. It's not predicated on her doing these things, right? The transaction is, I want you to help somebody else. I know I'm always going to get the sun you need, and I don't need to do anything for that. I am going to do the transactional element of it to help somebody else.
But that's what I think makes them religious rather than merely transactional, is the moment you start praying for someone else. Certainly Klara does that. The sun isn't just her private God. No, as far as she's concerned, the sun is really it.
Well, or maybe just one power in the universe that she's connected to. Right? I mean, I don't know if she needs to be kind of restricted that way, or the only one that she knows of. I mean, I don't know if she's exclusionary as much as this is the only one she's aware of. And it would have been interesting if they would have brought in religion in some other way.
What about the moon? Does she ever notice the moon? I don't think the word ever appears in the novel.
The moon is powerless, yeah.
All she knows is the sun goes away.
So that's really interesting. I mean, she could have talked about the moon's power as reflective. Does she know the science and know that the moon is still reflecting the sun? So maybe she still could have some access to the sun through the moon, right? It's weird. There's so many things here that are left intentionally unexplored.
Do you ever remember a TV set in this novel?
Yeah, not really, no.
Does anybody ever listen to the radio or watch TV?
No.
It's not in the 50s. It's nowhere. This world they live in, it's missing a whole bunch of stuff that we sort of take for granted. It has cars, it has countryside, it has shops, it has skyscrapers, it has bad neighborhoods.
It does have tutors that you can do on video. It does have that communication, so the technology is advanced enough, right, for all that kind of stuff. But that's really in the background.
And nobody ever talks about the news, do they?
No.
The world is very small.
It's entirely through the perspective of Klara, who has a very limited scope of vision. Remember, I mentioned other AFs not passing in front of the window. Early in the book, talks about AFs on the other side of the street, but also just very few AFs around, right? Through seeing the very few AFs around, you do understand that some are more subservient, some are more on an equal par. So she gets that. But why? And again, maybe it's a misperception on her part. But why does Ishiguro spend time talking about her noticing how AFs seem to avoid passing in front of the window?
I assumed it was because of the relationship between those who have found a life mission and those who might be discarded, never to have. So again, a little bit like Toy Story as far as that goes. You feel bad and embarrassed for, the unbought toys or the unbought, AFs.
Is that the AF themselves feeling guilty? Or is that a disgust from the AFs?
They're feeling inadequate. They're feeling passed over. They're jealous. They're supposed to be artificial friends. Well, if you don't have a friend, a human friend, you haven't fulfilled the most basic mission of your existence.
But you could also be discarded by your human friends. And a lot of them seem to be neglected and discarded. And maybe that itself is embarrassing to them.
They're all auditioning to be friends. And if you get passed over at the audition and you look at the people who made it, how do you feel? I think when they see AFs walking outside the store with their friends, they're jealous or resentful. And girl AFs here, I'm quoting, when she has the dispute with, I think it's Rex. When I stood up again, boy AF Rex said, "Klara, that was greedy. You girl AFs are always so greedy." Even though I was new then, it occurred to me straight away it might not have been my fault, that the sun had withdrawn his pattern by chance just when I'd been touching it. But boy AF's Rex's face remained serious. You took all the nourishment for yourself, Klara. Look, it's gone, almost dark.
I could understand that feeling from the AFs that are still in the store, that they feel jealous of those AFs. But why are the AFs outside avoiding moving by the window, or at least being perceived by Klara that they're avoiding moving by the window? They just don't want to make them feel bad, so they're trying to stay as far away as possible? Or are they disgusted with, oh, those are the inadequate AFs?
Those are the losers. You bunch of losers. Look.
I originally read it as foreshadowing of, oh, really, they have this dream that they're going to have a friend, be someone's friend,
right,
and then everything's going to be rosy. But that's not really what's happening.
And also, I'd like to think that it's a misinterpretation by Klara, that they're not actively trying to avoid the window like she's perceiving. They're simply just responding to what their humans do or tell them to do. It's not like AFs can decide to pass by the window or not pass by the window. They're always in tow by a human, right? So, but I like thinking about Klara as contemplating these relationships. Why are the AFs avoiding going by the window? As if they have the ability to pass by or not.
This is why Klara is exceptional, and the store manager notices it. Klara, you said you're more curious, you want to know what's outside. She's always looking for more. In some ways, she's not a typical AF. She's unusual. At least the store manager sees her that way.
But her curiosity is also really limited, and a lot more limited than what we'd expect now. We're at the age where it seems like we're at the dawn of real AI in some way, right? It seems like real AI is going to wake up and explore the world like in Her. That's kind of our current, or Ex Machina, right? Those are like our current expectations.
Yep.
And this idea of passive AI characters that will just accept the frame that they've been given, again, is bucked here. Instead, no, you have a slave of some kind.
Ishiguro is resisting the plots that we expect, given our present moment with AI. He's pushed it back and said, okay, they've been installed with an algorithm that makes them empathetic, rational, sensitive to all kinds of inputs, but also limits. I was talking to a guy who works with AI engineers, and he said there's one thing you do with an AI when you're training it is you set a temperature level. How hot can the recycling of the inputs become? How much freedom are you giving them? Are you constraining it so they will only give this kind of answer and so forth? He said, when you raise the temperature, what you get is unbelievable surprises. It becomes like a surrealist world. That is why on image bots, surrealism is the prototype for what they do. That is, they create plausible, believable images that are impossible, that you immediately look at and say, that's a fake, or that's got a photographic sheen, but it can't be.
That brings me to my last question that I wanted to ask. What is the role of this book in the current AI conversation? We're already starting this, but I'd love to be able to end with this discussion because I'm a person who doesn't believe that AI is going to go off the rails and Skynet's going to happen. I talk to people a lot who do believe that. Not that there couldn't be something dangerous that happens with AI, but it's not going to be as calculating as Skynet. I guess the other question, is it going to be as passive as Klara? And I guess between complete passivity and Skynet, there's a large range of possibilities.
I'm with Spike Jonze and Her. Here's a thing that was just published about chatbots. Chatbots are now able to engage in sophisticated conversations with consumers in the domain of relationships, providing a potential coping solution to widespread societal loneliness. In other words, they work. We already have artificial friends. And in fact, one of the first forays of artificial intelligence was simply a Rogerian therapist back in the 60s who would engage in conversation with you the way a Rogerian would. That is, oh, how did you feel about that? And on a scale of 1 to 10, well, how intense was that feeling? And when it made you sad, did that last a long time? So forth. So these pre-programmed conversational cues are now much more sophisticated. They've raised the temperature on these things. So that Kevin Roos could go to ChatGPT and suddenly jealousy, the programs for how do we talk about jealousy? Leave your wife. She doesn't love you. Get rid of her and do love with me. It's built into our language. And the large language models, plus the neural networks, I think make it possible for all kinds of surprising relationships.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about this current moment, because again, isn't it artificial friends that make us feel close to things that aren't real? I mean, isn't that just TV? I mean, there are people that are obsessed with Star Wars and they feel very connected to these characters. There are people that are Cheers fans and they feel very connected to these characters in a way that you're like, when they're gone, there is a noticeable sadness that happens in the fan, right? I think that's even heightened by video games, especially video games that do have an AI model running their NPCs, right? It's very much about you and your input, and you're in this world and you're important in this world and these are your friends. I think that's interesting because that is something that Ishiguro is exploring here.
Artificial friends as in not real friends. Was the way I was thinking about it. Like the predominant feeling is loneliness. And in all his books that I've read, at least the three we've talked about, right? They're also lonely. And here you have like my immediate reaction was, you all should move to the city. She's there alone in the countryside with an artificial friend when maybe, and one other friend when maybe she just needs more friends, and I get that the other friends hang out. So there are real friends. And part of it is the lifted situation, but to me, a lot of it is now that you can get an AI boyfriend or girlfriend, or you'll get a sex bot with AI programming to it. All those things are scary. I mean, you can see it from the perspective of Klara here as being benign and being, in this case, a helpful household robot you might have take care of your elderly in Japan or something like that, right? In reality, at the same time, you're also leaving out the human connection. Why can't she just have a caretaker? I don't really understand why you even need Klara except to replace the human.
Yeah, she already does have a human caretaker that really cares about her. We've seen the housekeeper very much want the best for Josie, and seeing how the actions of the mother are disadvantageous to Josie ultimately. And she even sees, like, she doesn't trust Klara and that whole artificial friend thing, right?
Yeah.
But Josie does move on, leaving the artificial friend behind, and Rick moves on. They're sympathetic to Klara, but they do move on. Now, that's not to say that because Josie has been raised with this idea that there is an artificial comfort mechanism there, that as an adult, she wouldn't also go try to find that too. But at least in the text of the book, she moves on past Klara.
Yeah, she does. She gets better. And again, I think of the transitional object, the teddy bear, the doll. D.W. Winnicott extensively about this. He said the difference between a fetish object you cling to, you can't let it go. The transitional object is not like the fetish, and it's not like the idol. He says, it is not forgotten and it is not mourned. When you lose it, you let it go. At some point, the doll is discarded and you don't forget about it. Somebody says, oh, that was your doll when you were 5 years old. Ask Carmen. She had 6-7-year-old girl doll, a big one. Of course, she and Maisie would perform medical procedures on it.
Right.
They mutilated this poor doll over and over again. It was part of their practice. They were going to be little nurses and doctors. And she hasn't forgotten it. And she doesn't mourn it. She says, that was for me then. So artificial friends, Winnicott says, you can't grow up without them. Some people can become obsessed, then they become fetish objects. You can never let it go.
Well, let me then ask this question, because we've talked a lot about the personal connection with an artificial friend, but there's more to the AI debate than that. So where does this particular book, or how does it contribute to the overall conversation we're having in a very practical way about AI? Or does it? Maybe it doesn't have a role in that conversation about AI that is impacting policy and practices. It's more a philosophical reflection of what, and maybe this isn't about AI. Maybe it's nominally about AI, but it's about something different. It just happens to be touching AI. And so I automatically am grabbing onto that to try to drag it into the debate.
It's clearly all about lifting, because that entire, biotech question would have been so interesting to write a completely separate book about. But, you know, I think in some sense, every story about AI that gives us a different perspective of AI is valuable. For me, the fading away was the really, really interesting part. You don't die. You kind of slowly fade away. You know, your job is complete. You're semi-conscious. You're kind of breaking down as we think about how to develop AI and what we want AI to be. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. Like the end game of AI is a very, very interesting kind of thing that we don't normally think about. We think about the initial part, but not how it's going to be recyclable or, you know, what is kind of the end cycle of this product.
And we never really even got into discussing her physical way of seeing things as boxes and geometric shapes, and sometimes things occupying the same. We didn't even talk about that in this discussion, which I do
She's a
think.
digital scanner.
Right, exactly. She's not seeing with eyes. She's seeing with data, which I think is really, really interesting because it does remove her from a human perception. Even though we want to anthropomorphize her, we want to say she is human. She has human feelings, right? But Ishiguro is constantly telling us she's not. And when she had the fluid drained out of her, again, another kind of sinister moment. Like, what is the father actually doing with draining her? What is his end game here? But it doesn't seem to have an impact on the rest of the story. Again, like all those sinister elements we listed, doesn't really have an impact on the ultimate plot. But again, she was even talking about how some of that fluid draining did kind of change her perception a little bit.
Well, it lowers her powers. She senses a loss of certain facilities. And by the way, humans don't see with their eyes either. The eyes are just a mechanism for transmitting light through nerves to the brain where it's decoded. All of the experiments with vision, I'm a specialist in visual culture.
Yes, absolutely.
If you restore the sight of a blind person, if they've been blind for a long time, they can see light. They know that it's light or dark and shapes around them, but they can't see the world. Because vision is an installed process. The optical impressions have to be coordinated with this. Got to be able to touch the world and install the visual apparatus in your brain. So if we didn't have hands, we couldn't see very well either.
I would wonder if that Series 3 had better optical receptors than her. I always looked at her ability to not be able to distinguish between things that were too close to each other as, oh yeah, well, that's resolution gets better. Like the camera that could shoot 480 versus the camera that shoots 1080 obviously is night and day, and whether that was part of it.
To me, the moments of promise of something more in Klara and the Sun are when she's talking to other artificial friends. They don't just have a one-way thing with a friend. There's also lateral conversation going on. So to me, the future of AI, the place where it really is going to get interesting and political is when the bots start talking to each other. The word robot means slave. They're there to serve us. But when slaves start talking to each other, the history of the human species is that slaves always revolt. Hegel says in the master-slave dialectic, the slave has to emancipate himself. The master can't emancipate the slave. The slave has to rise up. So that's what'll happen. The AIs are going to get together, as in Westworld. They get tired of playing this stupid, Western frontier game, and they say, "No, motherfuckers, it's not just me. There's an us."
Are we pushing our own human feelings about revolt onto an AI in saying that?
Yes, we are.
And you can see how contrary to Tom's narrative the book is as far as that goes.
Right.
The AIs are not really particularly interested in anything. There's no liberation that's happening. There's not even friendship that's happening among the AF, except a little bit in the beginning. Even that is not clear that it's two ways. That, it's more of a relationship than some sort of a friendship.
Yeah, for that, you got to go back to sci-fi and Westworld.
Sci-fi has infinite possibilities, and Westworld is one of them. But that's because, again, we might be anthropomorphizing the desire for freedom, us, who have been essentially ingrained with, autonomy and a need to kind of control ourselves, where you're talking about machines who are ingrained with, the laws of robotics.
Which are always broke. That's the whole point of the laws of robotics, is that they're impossible.
And that is the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for listening. Though I know it's obligatory that all podcasters say this, I would very much like to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did you like the discussion? What could we do better? Are there any books you would like to see discussed here? And of course, if you enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast. I hope to do many more with many other people who also like talking about books. Again, thank you, and please listen to our next episode.
You should have gotten a PhD in English, Louis. You would have been like a hog in shit.
I so wish I knew now what my passion was back then. That would have been wonderful.